D-Type and Lister, and he loved them and thought they were great.
Well, I think he certainly, given what he did within, also outside of racing Formula One cars, shows he was clearly versatile and adaptable.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you name a driver who immediately fell off in terms of competitiveness when the slicks and wings appeared? I don't think it changed the order really of who was good. I think all the same people were still good because they're still good.
Yeah.
I think if you take a top driver out of any era and plot them into another with enough, all the experience of data and all the rest of it, whatever they need to get up to speed, the thing that made them great in one era will make them great in another. So, I wouldn't hold that particular thing against Clark. I'm sure he would have won the championship in '68. What I would have been interested to see is a Clark Stewart fight in '69, and then Rindt as well. What would have happened to Rindt? Would he have gone to Lotus? That would have been interesting. Maybe not. Maybe just stayed at Brabham, so you'd have had. Or Jackie Ickx at Ferrari, Rindt at Brabham, Clark at Lotus, JYS in a Matra, and then a Tyrrell.
Pretty fantastic.
That'd have been cool, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would have been fascinating to see Clark go on for a few more years. That's because Formula One moves into a pretty remarkable era quite quickly in the few years after, and I think one of the reasons I hold Jackie Stewart in such high regard is because he was able to rise above everyone really in an era where there were so many good drivers. The competitive order was moving around quite regularly. But there weren't more competitive drivers in Jackie Stewart's era than Jimmy Clark's, I would say.
No, but there were more competitive cars, so there were more potential winners, I think. So that's when it's really, really tight, and you get lots and lots of winners and JYS. I think where I would, and this is only a gut feeling, but this is where I think why I would put Stewart ahead of Clark, which I know would upset lots of people, is I can't see Clark doing a kind of working in practice to get that longer fourth gear at Monza 69 to say that I think he would have been instinctive in a wheel-to-wheel situation. I know one of the criticism against him is not great wheel-to-wheel, but I didn't really find any real evidence.
He didn't have to do it very often.
But I think he would have had to do it. I couldn't find much evidence for that. Although I did find some evidence of him cracking under pressure, which we can come back to. But in terms of wheel-to-wheel stuff, I think he would have been up there with the best of them. But I just feel that Jackie Stewart probably would have been able to outthink Clark more often than the other way around in an equal situation.
Well, let's just briefly address that wheel-to-wheel thing, because that's often raised as a weakness of Clark, and I find that one a little bit odd because often you can't really criticise someone for being out front and dominating. Really, I don't feel that's a particularly fair criticism. It's like, you've done your job really well, but you haven't showed that if you'd done your job a bit worse, you could dig yourself out of that hole. You think, well. It's okay. I mean, you said you had a look and you couldn't really find any evidence.
Yeah. So in terms of wheel to wheel, there was the 1966 Dutch Grand Prix, which is also a rare example of him being in an inferior Lotus. It's a 2-litre Lotus against the 3-litre Brabham Repcos, and he basically takes the fight to Brabham and Holm falls back. He fights Brabham, gets past him, and does actually start to pull away. Jack starts to come back at him, and then the Lotus brakes on him, basically. He comes into pits and finishes third. And there's not a hint of a mistake. Track slippery, Zandvoort, dusty, all the rest of it. And he's absolutely immaculate in a wheel-to-wheel fight. So that's the sort of an example of him clearly not folding. And then against that was the sort of cracking under pressure. There are a couple of Tasman examples, but the one that's probably more famous, I suppose, is 1965 Brands Hatch Race of Champions. And I think it's interesting that it's Dan Gurney applying the pressure, because obviously, as we famously later found out, Gurney was the one guy Clark really sort of rated. And Gurney in that Brabham, I'd like to do a piece on that, because that 64-65 period of Gurney in the Brabham, that should have been a championship contending car, and it just broke too often. But he was putting the pressure on Clark at the Race of Champions. I think Clark had even won the first heat, so he didn't even really have to worry too much. And he crashed. Well, Dan caught him and put pressure on him, and he actually went off and ripped a wheel off the car. And so he wasn't perfect and error free in the way that sometimes it gets suggested. But I also don't think that there was any weakness in terms of wheel to wheel fights. There are a number of examples. One of the ones that made it into this was a '68. I think it was South African Grand Prix, where Chris Amon's Ferrari, I think, was a quicker race car, but Clark did that, what we would now consider to be great race management. He nailed the start, got the lead, and Amon could not get past. He got alongside quite a few times, and remember, this is before we've got dirty air and all the rest of it, so he had to be perfect. And they finished almost side by side, and it was an hour-long race, and Clark didn't buckle under that pressure. So, yeah, I think he was. I don't think there's an obvious wheel-to-wheel failing there.
Clark drove in so many different types of cars, as we talked about, and this whole versatility thing and the stamina he had.
as they all did, as in that era where they would go from weekend to weekend, and from continent to continent, driving all sorts of different things. In anything he drove, it's very hard to see a weakness. He wasn't infallible. He did make mistakes.
They all do. You will not find any racing driver who didn't make mistakes.
No, and that's why they're interesting. You don't want, who wants perfection really? I mean, but he, I just think overall they all knew who was best. He knew it as well. He probably wouldn't have admitted to it publicly because he was the kind of character he was, but he knew the best guys always know they're a cut above, and I think everything you see about Clark, he knew that as well.
I think there's no doubt that the peers, it was Fangio, then it was Moss, then it was Clark. I think that's pretty clear. In fact, there's some Autosport reports where they say we've not seen driving like this in Stirling, I think it's almost explicitly said that he's sort of taken the baton on really.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. We did almost 10 years ago now this F1's greatest drivers poll where we got a bunch of former World Championship Grand Prix drivers, well, and active ones, actually over 200 of them, to vote for their top 10 in a secret ballot. And Ayrton Senna came out on top, which was probably fairly predictable. Jim Clark came out fifth in that. And considering there was a certain degree of time period bias in that, because obviously the more recent you get, the more drivers there are still around to vote. So there were kind of fewer of contemporaries for Jim Clark to vote for him. Interestingly, he was one place ahead of Jackie Stewart. And it was Prost fourth, Fangio third, and Schumacher second behind Senna. So it's just interesting to see that, still he was able to hold his own in that. And I think it's very, very difficult to argue he shouldn't be in the top five.
You get a very different set of results if you run that poll now, wouldn't you? And that's the thing. It's things change as you go on, and perceptions of careers change. Is Schumacher remembered quite how we thought he would be now? You could argue maybe not, but I happen to think that Michael Schumacher in the mid-90s, he enjoyed a superiority over his contemporaries that no other racing driver has enjoyed. I don't think anyone has ever been as better than the rest, more than Michael Schumacher.
The only one I would put up against that is, I think after Fangio retired, I think Moss was miles better than everyone else, and chose to rock up in inferior cars just to make it interesting. So I think that Moss and Schumacher are the two in terms of their gap over the opposition. I'd agree that it's up there. But another way to assess the drivers is how they move the game on. So I think Moss, you could argue, was kind of the first sort of professional. JYS was the first modern driver. And Schumacher moved it on in terms of fitness and all that sort of stuff. Before him, even some of the top drivers would be sort of pulled out of the car, and now they all get out and it all looks all very, very easy. Less so with the new cars because they're really quick. Yeah. I don't think Clark moved things on, so that would count against him. But I mean, that's when you're nitpicking between who's the greatest of all time and who's second, sort of thing.
You can maybe argue that Clark was the first one to create quite such a tight relationship with the team.
Yeah, you could say that.
And to be so integral to the success of the team. Jackie Stewart was in the same way, but was anyone before Clark able to do that? One of the main criticisms of Fangio, amusingly, the flip side of this coin that people criticise, Clark only did it in Lotuses, then people say, well, Fangio just moved from team to team, so whoever was best. So Fangio never created that, and there were relationships with teams and manufacturers before that. Perhaps the Clark-Chapman axis is the first example of that in Grand Prix.
I think so.
Grand Prix racing.
I think Stirling had it to an extent with Rob Walker, but Rob wasn't a constructor.
Rob wasn't Colin Chapman in that way, was he?
No, Chapman was another completely different type of beast. I think you're right. They set a template about driver and constructor forming this sort of bond, and the results speak for themselves, really.
Well, it's an interesting question, isn't it? It's what would Lotus have achieved in that period with another leading driver?
Not as much.
Because, for example, you can talk about...
I'm convinced of it.
I mean, clearly Graham Hill, who I think is a driver who gets underrated.
I agree.
I find this whole... You get this projection of Jim Clark as the great natural talent who just rocked up, never had to try and was just brilliant, and Graham Hill is this hard trier who somehow is lessened by the fact he had to work hard. The reality was completely different. But then you ask, well, Graham Hill won the championship in the Lotus 49, which Clark spent quite a long time the previous year kind of getting on top of. It was a tricky car it was always a tricky car, in fact, but particularly when it was first running. So you sort of wonder, well, what role did Clark play in what Hill did kind of in his memory, if you like, in 68. You're guessing, but that was very important.
Yeah, you won't. I don't suppose you'll ever really know that one.
But Graham Hill I think he's vastly underrated, and we like to put him in this box as the grafter. But it's true. His role in developing the 49 was immense in terms of what the input he had in that car, and Clark benefited from that, I'd say. But over a season, only one of them was really going to emerge as the.
Yeah, I think in a way Graham's greatest achievement really was the way that he was a little bit like Damon at Williams in '94. The way he responded and picked up the Lotus team, and whether he'd won the championship or not, it was an amazing personal achievement to do that. I think even Colin Chapman turned up for the next Grand Prix, or certainly not in the start of the weekend. And Graham effectively was team manager and lead driver, and galvanising the team. I think that's an incredible personal achievement.
Well, it's one of those funny little echoes, isn't it? That Graham Hill won the Spanish Grand Prix, which was the next World Championship round in 68, and Damon Hill won the Spanish Grand Prix in 94, which was 2 rounds on because Monaco was before Spain that year, and then went on to have a run at the title, even though Schumacher, rightly I would say, regardless of what happened in Adelaide, Schumacher was the leading driver that season. Kind of digressing there a little bit, but actually Graham Hill's an example of how a driver hanging around for a bit too long can maybe affect their perception. It's very hard for us to judge because that's before our time how that changed things. But if Hill, obviously the moment everything changed for him was when he broke his legs at Watkins Glen in 69, and then he's still hanging around as late as 75, not qualifying for the Monaco Grand Prix. Yeah. And, over the hill and damaged, excuse the pun of over the hill, but who knows how much impact that has on the way Graham Hill's seen. I mean, I know some of that perception was there at the time because you see it before that, but who knows what would have happened for Jim Clark. What if the accident in the Deutschland Trophy at Hockenheim was a bit different, and he broke both his legs and then came back and wasn't the same driver for I can't see him hanging around for quite as long as Graham Hill did, but you never know.
It's this thing again about Clark's frozen in time, that we didn't get to see him decline. He was still at the height of his powers when he was killed, and we didn't see how he had responded to the threat of a Jackie Stewart or a Jochen Rindt, and how he'd handled that, and whether he'd accepted it and walked early, or whether he'd have battled on in a Graham Hill style. It's hard to see him doing the Graham Hill thing. I think if you'd seen the signs, you get the feeling with Clark that he'd have gone on to find other things in life. But
it would have been interesting to
would he have gone back to being a farmer, as people have often said, or would he, had his mindset changed, and would he have gone on to something completely different? Yeah,
and it was interesting reading the thoughts of the people immediately after he died. Actually, there was Jabby Crombat, his friend, journalist. There was I spoke to John Surtees, Jackie Stewart, Colin Chapman. So it had all these different people that knew him to one degree or another, and they couldn't agree on what they thought he would do. Some, no, he would definitely have gone back to the farm, and others were like, well, he'd seen a new world now. He was quite happy to go. He liked the international lifestyle, so maybe he'd have hung around doing sort of something else. But it's one of those sort of great mysteries that we won't get to find out.
And it's easy to forget that Jim Clark was only 32 when he died. He had quite a lot of he had a lot of years left in him. Yeah. And what was he, 7 years younger than Graham Hill? So let's say he carried on as late as Graham Hill. Is Jim Clark failing to qualify for the 1982 Monaco?
I see more.
I can't see him lasting that long, but it shows just how much time there still was to keep going. We talk about inevitably what happened in 68, 69, but he could still be hanging around in 75, 76, which seems completely, because he's frozen in that black and white wingless era, isn't he? Yeah. But it wouldn't have taken long for him to break in, and then suddenly he's in a whole new era, which is impossible. It's almost impossible to picture, isn't it?
Well, look at Jack Brabham. He just at the start of the whole mid-engined revolution, and still good enough to win a Grand Prix with slicks and winnings in 1970. And obviously Clark was that bit younger, so it's easy to see him into the. He could have carried on after JYS retired and come up against Niki Lauda.
Which is absolutely
which is a bit weird. It doesn't seem right, does it? But it's actually not impossible.
It's like Gilles Villeneuve could have been up against Ayrton Senna at his McLaren peak later. Yeah. It's all these fascinating kind of possibilities. But I think what there's no doubt of is that Clark would have risen to the challenges. For me, the thing that always defines whether these great drivers are able to continue, it's either physical limitations which happened more often back then when you could get more serious injuries. Nowadays, thankfully, injuries are rare. So it's more just as well as the